Hello. Good evening. My name is Jonah Chester, and I am one of your Rising Waters reporters. Alongside my colleague Toby Cox, I'll also be one of your moderators for tonight. From those of us at the Post and Courier, Groundswell, and the Sierra Club, I want to welcome you all to the Rising Waters Forum. We've got a great lineup of panelists for the evening. Faith Rivers James is the executive director of the Coastal Conservation League, a nonprofit environmental advocacy organization. The group has been a prominent and sometimes critical voice in Charleston, sharing opinions on climate adaptation strategies, major infrastructure projects, and more. Jared Bramblett is a senior water resources engineer at Moffitt & Nichol, which was one of the engineering groups that helped craft the water plan. You might also recognize Bramblett as the person behind Mean High Water, a popular local Instagram account that documents flooding across Charleston. His photos will be displayed on the screen behind us this evening. Keith Bowers is the president of Biohabitats and another one of the water plan's consultants. Bowers' Mount Pleasant-based company aims to provide nature-based solutions to the climate change-related threats coastal communities face. And last, but certainly not least, Kaylin Kazella is the City of Charleston's Director of Resilience. Kazella's job is to help Charleston prepare for the impacts of a changing climate. She's the person shepherding projects contained in the water plan through their creation and construction. Before we get underway this evening, I want to also introduce you to Susan Lyons, who will say a few words about Dale Morris, who we lost last week. If you want it.
Good evening and welcome, a warm welcome to so many of you for this first public discussion about Charleston's first comprehensive water plan. On behalf of Groundswell, I want to thank all who collaborated with such dedication to bring this about. Christine von Kolnitz and Nina Fair of the Sierra Club, former City Councilwoman Carol Jackson, Claire Linney of the Post and Courier, and of course Jonah and Toby and their editor Adam Parker of Rising Waters. Some history. More than 7 years ago, after 3 consecutive major flood events in Charleston, a group of neighbors gathered in my dining room and launched what would become the grassroots group, Groundswell. Within weeks, we had 300 homeowners on our mailing list. Many of them had experienced repeated flood damage, as I had, from up to 3 feet of water in their yards, their crawl spaces, and in their homes. At the time, Charleston had no flood office, no resilience officer, no plan for what we now know as existential climate change. It was long before sea level rise and global warming had become household phrases. Groundswell began holding public information meetings, sort of like this one, to educate and provide practical help with flooding, and we worked to persuade the mayor and city council that something had to be done to keep us safe. We sponsored election debates on flooding, and one with the Sierra Club, and we lobbied the BAR on behalf of homeowners who at that time were not allowed to elevate their houses in the historic district. And we encouraged public engagement wherever possible. Progress. A part-time resilience officer became full-time. A U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Peninsula study was initiated, and a Citizens Advisory Committee on Perimeter Protection was appointed. And a resilience plan was launched for Rosemont, a chronically flooded African-American community in the North Peninsula. The mayor and several officials and city staff traveled to the Netherlands to learn how the Dutch keep their feet dry, and the Dutch Dialogues, a layered approach to flood mitigation, was commissioned and ultimately received wide acclaim. Dale Morris was a principal in the Dutch Dialogue study. When Mark Wilbert was the first resilience officer, retired in June of 2021, Dale became Charleston's chief resilience officer. He took up the mission that Groundswell had long advocated for, and ever so much more. With Dale's tragic death last weekend, tonight's event is bittersweet, which is why it seems important to note that he was the first to educate us about the role of a water plan. These are his words. This plan is a guiding framework to aid the city, its citizens, and stakeholders to make decisions about safety, risk, and quality of life issues related to water for this generation and the next. It will ensure that land-based use, flood risk mitigation, and investment are viewed comprehensively and sustainably across basins, floodplains, neighborhoods, and the entire city footprint. Dale was compiling a handout for this audience at the time of his death, but we will follow up with a guide with you on email. On a personal note, I worked with Dale. I learned from him, and I admired his integrity and the breadth of his knowledge. He was the loveliest of people, and I am privileged to have called him my friend. I've been asked to announce that a community memorial for Dale has been planned for Sunday, May 18th at 4 p.m. at the Clamson Design Center on East Bay Street, where he had been teaching. Thank you. Jonah, back to you.
Thank you, Susan. During his time as Charleston's Chief Resilience Officer, Dale left his impact on projects and people across the city. Before we turn our attention to the main discussion this evening, I wanted to offer each of the panelists an opportunity to reflect on Dale's impact in Charleston. But we're actually going to start with my colleague, Toby Cox, who would like to talk a little bit about what Dale meant to us.
Thank you, Jonah. For both Jonah and I, we arrived in Charleston not knowing anything about flooding or the mechanics behind it or why Charleston floods. And Dale was the first person we met outside of the newsroom. And my first impression was Dale was an extremely talented and patient communicator, explaining all of the mechanics behind flooding in Charleston and its resilience needs. So he will be greatly missed.
I remember the first time I met Dale was when the contingent planning the Dutch Dialogues came to town. And over 2018, as they were looking at projects and learning about the city's landscape, Dale's approach and the Dutch Dialogues approach to looking for multi-benefit infrastructure that doesn't just fix flooding, but also improves quality of life and provides other benefits, really struck me. And I don't think I would be where I am right now had I not met Dale. Definitely had a huge impact on my career and my career path. And some of my photos that you'll see behind us tonight, it's going to be weird the next time I go out during a king tide or a flood, because I was often thinking about Dale and what Dale would say or how he would respond to those flooding and what we should do about it. He'll be greatly missed.
Thanks, Jared. I will speak from a colleague perspective, from a friend perspective, from a mentor perspective, because that's what Dale was to me. And that's how he'll continue to carry him as I move forward with this work. It's my greatest honor to carry his legacy forward in the work in the city of Charleston. I said a minute to express about Dale. I can't do that in a minute, but he was such a teacher. He was empathetic when talking about these issues with people. He brought a human value to them. He will say he also brought an economic value as an economist, but we will deeply miss Dale, and we will continue to carry his legacy through this work.
I had the opportunity to meet Dale as we were talking about Union Pier and trying to look at resilience in the context of our planning for the city. Dale was a prophetic voice about how we should learn to live with water. And as we move forward, we will always hear his voice calling us to take action, to not ignore what we see in front of us, and to take steps to include everybody. He was very forthcoming about where we had infrastructure, where we didn't, and how the calculations would work with the Corps of Engineers. But it was very clear that the city would be in the driver's seat in making sure that whatever our perimeter protection was, it met our design standards. He really worked hard to express a view in some very difficult situations, and I honor his legacy and I'm proud to carry on this work.
Like Jared, I first met Dale at the Dutch Dialogue charrettes that we had here in Charleston. And I was a little intrigued and skeptical about this group coming in and, basically saying, here's what you need to do in Charleston. And Dale got up to speak and completely gave confidence in me, and I think to the rest of the group there, that they knew what they were doing. And I come to find out that Dale's background was in policy when he worked in D.C. Then he went to the Water Institute down in the Gulf and learned about hydrology and flooding. And then he teamed up with Wagner Ball, the architecture and urban design firm out of New Orleans, to do the Dutch dialogues. And so here's somebody that had policy, had a good understanding of the physics and flooding, and also a good understanding of urban design. And very rarely do you ever find that from someone. And he became not only a professional colleague for me, but he also became a good friend. We would often go out and have dinner or lunch. And in fact, I'm supposed to go in and guest lecture his class on Thursday, and it's just going to be really tough, but we miss him. And hopefully this gathering tonight is sort of in honor of Dale. Thank you.
Thank you all. Now, I'd like to take a moment to provide some background info that will help frame tonight's discussion. Charleston is flooding more now than ever before. According to the National Weather Service, our city experienced 54 tidal floods last year. That's more than it did in the entire period from 1922 to 1958. Those are the first full years on the Weather Service's Charleston Harbor record. Those tidal floods will become more frequent and severe as sea levels in the area are set to rise another foot plus by 2050. But rising waters are also warming waters. As we face an increase in sunny day tidal flooding, coastal South Carolina is also confronting a new generation of hurricanes. Boosted by a warming climate, these storms are getting stronger, faster. And as if all of that weren't enough, we're also sinking. Parts of South Carolina are going down faster than others. Here in Charleston, centuries of creating artificial ground is catching up to us. Filled creeks and marshes are often first and worst to flood. By some estimates, roughly half of the modern-day peninsula is built on some kind of reclaimed ground. In fact, this very library was built on top of a salt marsh. These are the challenges we face. Last August, Charleston released its years-in-the-making water plan. The aim of that strategy is to guide the city through the next 25 years of climate change and rising seas. Included in the plan are dozens of infrastructure projects and hazard mitigation initiatives. Our focus this evening will be on the water plan. But the goal of this conversation is also to examine what coastal resilience means in a changing climate, how we can learn to live with water, and what we want Charleston to look like in 2050. For our first question tonight, I'll pass the mic off to my fellow Rising Waters reporter, Toby Cox.
Thank you, Jonah. So resilience is going to come up a lot this evening, and it's one of those terms that's very easy to use but tricky to define, and that ambiguity makes it a very popular political buzzword. So to kick things off, what does resilience mean to you in a changing climate?
We'll begin with Jared, since he's close.
Yep.
I think at the root, resilience is the ability to adapt, respond, and really thrive in the face of increasing stressors, like Jonah just highlighted. But I also think it's acknowledging the sense of place of what Charleston is, the history, the beauty, why we all live here, what the Low Country is. And I think there's ways that we can honor the sense of place that's here and become more resilient by embracing and living with water. Like, how do we invite water into our landscape and create systems that can adapt and thrive to these changing stresses? And we have to start by looking forward. I think that there's 3 tenets of the water plan that kind of came out as the team was working together to finalize it, and that's elevation, make space for water, and act now. And I think all 3 of those, there's only limited high ground, so we need to think strategically about how we use that space, the best use for that land. As you mentioned, the tidal creeks on the peninsula in particular, they're the most flood vulnerable. They're the first to flood during tidal flood events. They're the first to flood during rainfall events. We've really built ourselves into this flood risk by not making space for water, by not thinking about how water is going to interact in that environment. And then I think importantly, knowing those two things, it's how do we strategically and smartly act now and start investing now?
Sure. Guess we'll just go down the line. For me, I think, I think y'all nailed it, and as did Jared. It is this ability to adapt, but resilience, I think it depends on what community and you're in, right? Every city faces a different challenge or stressor that they're trying to adapt to. Here, I think in Charleston and probably likely most coastal communities, it's through the lens of water that we're looking when we think of resilience. But I really think the opportunity we have here in Charleston and utilizing the water plan as like that launching pad is, Jonah, you laid out a lot of gloom and doom, but I will bring the optimistic perspective that it actually is really unique opportunities that we can leverage these challenges to solve, right? Is a resilient community in Charleston we're not just solving flooding, we're also tackling about, some concerns with how do we make a traffic project also a flooding project? How do we also make a flooding project a public amenity? That to me is a really way we make Charleston truly resilient. Is you're making something that has economic value, ecological value, and social value for folks. And I see that as a really optimistic, positive pathway to resilient Charleston. And that's what gets me really excited talking about these things and what resilience means here in Charleston.
To me, resilience is how Dale described it. We learn to live with water. That includes preserving the ecological functions of our natural environment. We have wetlands, which are each acre of wetlands can hold 1 million gallons of floodwater. So every time you fill an acre, that's 1 million gallons that's looking to go elsewhere. And so resilience means we're going to pay attention to that infrastructure. We're also going to provide infrastructure. The Rosemont community didn't have infrastructure. Yeah, it floods. Well, but they don't have stormwater. They don't have gray infrastructure. So to me, resilience means providing the gray infrastructure that people need, but also green infrastructure wherever we can, right? Because green infrastructure helps us preserve that ecological function so that we can move forward. But it also, to me, means let's make good choices. As we're looking at what's coming down the pike, let's pay attention to the water plan. They did a great service for us of providing a road path that isn't limited to city jurisdiction lines, but it looks at the basins. And so with the information, we're now empowered to make better choices and make plans so that everyone has access to being able to stay in place as long as they can.
Faith and I are sitting together because we're both on the green infrastructure side, right? So I sort of define resiliency as, yes, the idea that you adapt and you bounce back, but I think a lot of scientists now are saying, I'm not sure about bouncing back. I'm not sure we can bounce back. Maybe what we need to do is sort of bounce forward into a new paradigm, into a new way of thinking. And for me, resiliency is sort of opening up and embracing this idea that there are different ways that we can live on the landscape. The other, I think, related factor to that is that in the sustainability sort of realm, we're always trying to find that middle ground between the economy, between our social and cultural activities, and between ecology and the earth. And I'm sort of the standpoint that without the ecological foundation and without that underpinning the cultural, which is then underpinning the economy, we're not going to get there. And so I really believe that we need to really think long and hard, and maybe this is opening up to this other paradigm, that the ecological functioning of the landscape is what really needs to be the foundation for everything that we do going forward. So yes, we're in a crisis from a climate change perspective, But we're also, and I would argue, a greater crisis from a biodiversity perspective. That even if we solve climate change tomorrow, we're losing species at an unbelievable rate, and it's going to have unbelievable consequences for maybe our generation, but certainly generations going forward. So again, thinking about resiliency of bouncing forward into other different types of paradigms is how I like to frame that.
Thank you all. So I guess we can use, this next time to bounce forward into our discussion about the water plan. So for each of you, we would love to know, what project or aspect of the water plan you feel is the most pressing or critical now for Charleston.
Shall I switch it up and start, Jared? Okay. Thanks, Toby, for that question. I think it's important because I think everybody in this room, because you're an advocate of the water plan, likely or want to hear more information, has maybe soaked it in and digested it. But if you haven't, it's really, really a lot of graphic visuals, awesome content from background of water in Charleston, and goes through all of our risks, and it goes through each planning area and community in the city, and there's really a lot to absorb, but in a really accessible way. And that's why we asked the team to develop in this online format instead of this really static traditional document. There's everything from some concept idea of projects to policy recommendations, but really to me the most critical is the values and principles embedded in the water plan that literally the city is leveraging today for how we invest in future infrastructure. So that's really exciting. And I would say the main principle of the three principles that Jared mentioned is this act now. I think sometimes in this world of resilience and sustainability, getting people to care when you're talking 25 years out is really hard, right? Because particularly local government, people just want their trash picked up and they want their ditches cleaned, and they don't necessarily always trust that you're going to actually solve something from 25 years from now if they don't believe that you can do and fix their problems now, right? And we need to do it in this approach, and the water plan lines that out, that you can align near immediate actions with these longer term as you act now and adapt over time. And I think that's really critical as we think about how we're going to solve and tackle these problems in Charleston, because it is an either or. We need to be cleaning the ditches and the drainage in folks' neighborhood now and by their basin. And we also need to be focused and acting now on really big, bold projects, because the water plan's taught us, Jonah laid it out, we need to act now, right? There's not time to waste. Things are only going to increasingly get challenging for us from a water perspective. So that's really critical. And I will also highlight on this act now, one of the first things Mayor Cogswell did and the city did was they utilized the water plan and these basin maps to start planning and get this idea for folks to start planning by your basin. Know your basin. We have these awesome, I'll do a little plug for it. We have these awesome basin action maps that our design division put together, and you see our current stormwater projects, maintenance efforts. You live in the James Island Creek Basin, you pull it up, we had an interactive map, you can look at it. You also can see then the water plan concept projects. And right now we're actively as a city, building and blending these projects to help prioritize and strategize smart investment. So really this act now and this need to do things in a really near term and incremental and smart way that the water plan helps guide us is what I really think is foundational and critical for as we're looking how we invest at the city level.
And I'll jump on that. I think that the concept of watershed-based planning as we look forward, and not just water resources or stormwater or flood mitigation projects, but all projects that we look to invest in across the watershed, thinking about how it impacts the watershed. And I think that's what the water plan does, is it establishes this watershed-based approach, which has and is being carried forward. The other is, I think it's a systems thinking approach. It's a physics approach. It's modeling the water, its impact over the land, and how and where it could flood under different scenarios. The future's unknown. We know from scientific data that by 2050 it's 12 to 14 inches of sea level rise most likely. But beyond that, it's more, and it's building in and thinking about that adaptive capacity and how we can invest in infrastructure now, how we can think about what we invest in, and then what does that investment look like 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the road, so that we can then anticipate how it needs to be adapted in the future.
So I agree with all that, and just to kind of build on that and build from a systems perspective, we need to, and this is outlined in the water plan, to really marry up the zoning regulations, the zoning code and ordinances, the building codes, the transportation planning. All of that needs to come together as sort of a whole to speak toward how do we deal with flooding, storm surge, sea level rise in the future here. So it's just not the water plan that we need to be focused on. It's all these other things that we also need to bring into the equation. And again, I'll go back to having a really strong ecological underpinning for the water plan. The more we can protect and conserve and restore wetlands, both freshwater and tidal wetlands, look at living shorelines. One of the most effective ways to deal with stormwater is planting trees, believe it or not. And the more that we can plant trees throughout the city of Charleston, imagine the city with 40, 50, 60% canopy cover over the city. Imagine most of the roofs going forward, because of building codes, have to be green roofs. There are all kinds of things that we can do to really effectively manage stormwater, manage flooding within the city, as we're also addressing flooding from Ashley River, Cooper River, and from the hurricanes and other storms that are hitting us.
I want to go back a little bit before we go forward and tell a story about my experience. I'm a native of Charleston, and my youngest sister, when she came back to Charleston after getting her graduate degree, she was able to buy a new car. And we live in Mount Pleasant, and so she came across the bridge to get to her job at the medical university, and her brand new car flooded out. Brand new car. And so imagine the stress of that. And she was panicked sitting in this car with the water coming in. And so a few years later, I was at a conference with some folks from the Community Foundation and some national folks, and someone from the city was there. And I mentioned this incident. And he said something about, well, you know, it's really expensive to fix it. And all my life I'd thought, oh, this flooding was just nature. And I looked at him and I said, you could fix that? So I was surprised to learn that this was something that could be tackled. I think the beauty of the water plan, in addition to what's in it, it also points out that a lot of our crisis is not just new water, it's infrastructure. Right? Clearing out our infrastructure, ensuring that our roadways have enough drainage, providing infrastructure for folks who live in low-lying areas, because without it, they can't operate their wells and their septic systems. And so infrastructure is important for people to stay where they are. But also, there are some components of the plan that say, well, yes, infrastructure needs to be there, it needs to be cleaned, but also we can plan better. And so when we look at where we're going to build, things like elevation zoning help us remember that if you're going to go closer to the water, maybe you don't need that to be a highly dense neighborhood. We also need to keep in mind that every neighborhood is not new. And this is a conversation that Dale and I enjoyed having. And it was explaining to him that many of our settlement communities are along the coastal areas, along those former plantation lands where African Americans were able to buy property after the Civil War. And so much of our waterfront, it's not just Isle of Palms and Kiowa. It's 10 Mile, it's Hamlin. And those folks need some solutions as well. So green infrastructure is something that will help them a lot. Preserving green spaces will help them a lot. So I think the water plan's beauty is that it starts a conversation and hopefully gets us to some commitments about how we're going to help people wherever they are.
There was a lot of great context in those responses, but I'd like to kind of seize upon one thing in particular. Jared, you had a really good line where you mentioned that the future is unknown. Now, the water plan is built over a 25-year planning horizon that kind of follows the most reliable climate change models from agencies like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. But if there's one thing that's certain in a changing climate, it's uncertainty. There will be storms that are worse than forecast, and there will be floods that catch us unaware. So how does the water plan sort of account for that uncertainty?
Again, it's building that adaptive capacity, and so it's looking at if something, and you think about storm surge. Like, we're not designing. If you look at the flood risk, it's yes, the Army Corps project's looking to prevent damages from storm surge on the peninsula. But that's not a common event. It's not like the sunny day tidal flooding we see. It's not like an afternoon thunderstorm. It's predicted. It's once, hopefully not once a year, but it's not a frequent event. And so it's looking, not necessarily designing to those storm surge levels all the time, but designing to look at, well, what does rainfall look like today? What could it look like in 25 years? What could it look like in 50 years? And pairing that with different scenarios. So the technical approach we employed in the water plan was looking at the different boundary conditions or the different sea level rise scenarios where stormwater is going to hit the ocean and how that's going to come in over land. And then how does it interact with our built environment? How does it interact with the topography of the landscape? And so that's how we ultimately identified the projects that were in the water plan is it's not this needs to be done here or this has to be done here. They're concepts that are based on these areas that were indicated as being at flood risk. And so as you look at those, then it starts becoming a benefit cost analysis equation of what can we afford to do here? What should we do here? What does the public want here? Community engagement and building these projects and working with the communities, because ultimately it's not going to be successful unless you have community buy-in and it's what they want or what people want in their neighborhoods. And so I think it's just building in that adaptive capacity, knowing that you're not always going to be right, learning from your mistakes, and really, again, I go back to the tidal creeks. I pick on them a lot, but it's making space for water and it's thinking about long-term consequences of what we do and what could happen.
Just real quick. We talk about adaptability and adaptive management, but our economic system, our funding, our political system is not geared toward adaptive management as it stands now, right? We're on a 2 to 4 year political cycle. Funding comes and goes and has to be spent, within a year or maybe a little bit longer. People want to see a return on their investment pretty quickly. And really, to undertake a comprehensive and robust, well thought out adaptive management approach requires you to be thinking on 20, 30, 40, 50, 100-year timeframes and being willing to set up sort of the policy infrastructure to allow that to happen. And we're not there yet. And so that is one of the recommendations in the water plan, and there's a lot of work to do on that, and I think we can do it. There's a lot of good adaptive management programs that have been started in various communities for a lot of different reasons, and we can learn from that. But we still have a lot to learn, as Jared said. I think it's one thing to have sort of a hypothesis and go out and design, say, the storm surge barrier. It's another thing to understand whether that's really going to work in the future and to have some type of adaptive management program where we're collecting data, we're analyzing it, we're going out and making interventions to make sure that that is adapting over time to our needs is going to be critically important. So that infrastructure for adaptive management shouldn't be taken lightly, and it's something that I think Charleston really needs to embrace.
Now, Keith, I'm so glad you brought up the tumultuous nature of politics, because that opens the door for me to pick on Kaylin a little bit here. Now, many of the projects in the water plan are going to depend on financial or logistical support from federal agencies like NOAA or like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I don't know if you all have been reading the news recently, but we're seeing mass layoffs and cuts. So amid those pullbacks, what's the strategy, or what's the city's strategy for navigating climate resilience projects like those in the water plan, under an administration that is skeptical of the value of such initiatives?
Thanks. I think that's a really important conversation to have because, as Keith pointed out, I mean, we go through these cycles and the winds are going to shift and change of what's a priority at whether it's a regional, state, or federal level. And the projects that we're talking about they need to be sustainable, not necessarily in our world of resilience sustainability and green, but sustainable in the definition of these are projects that can, how do we need to write the narrative to appeal to who's doling out the funding, right? It's like if we don't use the word climate, okay, like we'll show what an impact. Again, it goes back to this, how do we leverage a climate project, quote unquote, or a flooding project for other benefits? Who's the audience you're appealing to that you're talking to a little bit to? And I think, that's just how you find success. But again, we're talking a lot of these projects are large scale projects, and it really does. Another key component and recommendation from the water plan is this idea of the need for more collaboration at all scales of government level, from a regional way, again, water knowing no boundaries. You jump off the peninsula to James Island, Johns Island, even parts of West Ashley. We're a checkerboard, right, of jurisdictions. We have a lot of assets here in Charleston that is appealing to the state. So where do we collaboratively find other resources as well that we know that we can sustain at a local level or a state level? Federal funding, it's not all going away, right? Again, it's like, how are you? I talk to I work with the Army Corps and talk to them all the time. A lot of the concepts we're still moving forward with this project. It's maybe just the way you're approaching in the narrative and some of the benefits that you're emphasizing. And I think we can still do this work of climate adaptation in whatever political climate we're sitting in, because when I really dove into this work in my time in Charleston, flooding, impacts of sea level rise, they're not really political, right? Somebody that their yard floods or somebody that's seeing water come into their house or trying to get downtown to their job, like they're not like, well, this is a Democrat or Republican issue. I mean, there's just an issue they're dealing with, and they expect the city to be tackling it and planning for it, like regardless of, who's at, sitting in the White House or in Columbia. So I think it's really a strategy that we here at the city are ready to, hey, this is why you need to invest in Charleston, because this is a really exciting project, or this is really going to be transformational for our city, and it's going to check so many solutions that we're dealing with, whether it's what are the biggest issues you hear in Charleston? Affordability, transportation, flooding, right? How can we identify some of these big projects and tackle it all, and how we have to fit that narrative to get to somebody's funding sources? I think we can do that because, again, a resilient Charleston is not just, necessarily being dry. It's improving this quality of life through these kind of unique opportunities that flooding presents to us and how we can address it and invest in the future.
Thank you. A little while ago, Jared, you mentioned one big part of the water plan was identifying high areas to build. And Faith, you mentioned the importance of balancing growth and the people who are already here. So maybe we could start a discussion on what opportunities the water plan presents for balancing conservation and growth in Charleston.
Faith, would you like to start?
Great, thank you. Conservation in the midst of Charleston is always a balancing act. And so I think the water plan gives us the foundation to say, as we balance, let's be sure what that future will look like. And so for us, one of the biggest challenges we see on the forefront and one of the biggest opportunities is that the water plan looks to the Kainhoy Peninsula as high ground for future growth and development. There are parts of the Kainhoy Peninsula that are high ground, and that is where growth and development would be directed. Our challenge, though, is that some of the plans for that development would fill 200 acres of wetlands and put homes in harm's way. Are we going to build communities that are, protected for storm surge, but then what are you supposed to do when the flooding becomes a regular tidal issue? Don't have a heart attack during a rain event? you're supposed to leave during a hurricane. And so we think that there are opportunities, though, to concentrate the growth on the high ground. We need housing. We need housing that is attainable. We need housing that is dry. And so that section of the community is adaptable for building. We just think it ought to be more concentrated, and it ought to consider the impacts on neighbors. Chairman Middleton is here. You hear people at county council all the time talking about the development that came in next door. Now it's flooding my home. And so the Jack Primus community, which is right next to that Kane Hoy development, is already saying, we're going to flood if you start filling and billing and cutting all the trees. So I think the beauty of the water plan is that it says, let's take a holistic approach. Let's go where it's high, but let's also take account of the impacts of people around us. That was one of our issues with Union Pier, right? You could build it up, but what was it going to do to the neighborhood around you? So I think the water plan encourages us to think holistically, to target the high ground, but I think it also encourages us to reserve our ecological functions and preserve our wetlands.
I'll just add, I think Faith said it earlier, but as you talk about development, and if I think that it comes across as, let's build the high ground, let's just develop the whole high ground. And I don't want to come across that that's ultimately what the water plan is recommending. High ground is valuable, and we need to use it to our best advantage. And I think we need to talk as a community to come up with what that best advantage is. Because you do have people that live there. You have heirs communities in some of these areas. You have residents that live there today that have lived there for 50 years. And it will impact how they've lived in these areas. So it can't just be this broad-brushed approach that we need to develop these high ground. Conversely, it's also not, we don't need to develop the low ground. We need to be smart about how we build buildings in these low ground. And are they elevated? What do you do with your car when it floods? There's still ways that we can continue to grow. There's still ways that we continue to live where we are. It's just thinking about elevation and how we respond and how we use it to our advantage.
Thank you. And another question, this might be for Keith, but anyone can jump in. Are there any nature-based solutions that you think would be a really great fit for Charleston that haven't been used yet?
You mean for flooding or in general?
Flooding, and anything that would
Yeah.
help with flooding.
So for me, nature-based solutions, first and foremost, you start out protecting what you already have. And a lot of times we forget that. A lot of times we look at infrastructure, or we look at building or developing, and we slap nature-based solutions on top of that without really thinking about how do we conserve and protect what we already have. So first and foremost, I think we sort of did a calculation that if you drew this imaginary line from the bridge across the peninsula, and the lower half of the peninsula, before the 1600s, there was roughly 2,000 acres of tidal wetlands. And through colonization and development, we're now down to less than 600. And so the first thing we need to do is protect those tidal wetlands that are remaining in there, right? To the greatest extent possible, because they're going to provide or help provide some of the buffer that we're looking at. I think the other thing we need to do, we did a plan for the city of Atlanta where we did this ecological overlay for the city to look at how to reconnect habitat, how to add trees, how to deal with flooding from a nature-based approach. And that was integrated in with their housing plan, with their transportation plan, with their zoning. And so I think we need to look at ways where we can integrate sort of these nature-based approaches that are both what you do for gray infrastructure, how do you improve gray infrastructure, but how do you improve your green infrastructure as well? And we can do that for the city of Charleston.
Yeah, I think it's great that you bring up an example of a project happening next door, kind of, in Atlanta. Do y'all know of any other projects that are happening in other places that could be applied to Charleston?
Well, I was going to talk about what we're doing in Charleston. I think what the water plan laid out, and one of the key conceptual projects that we laid out is this, at least for the peninsula, is this restoration. Keith pointed out how we have degrading wetlands, not much left here, at least in the peninsula. And when we think about nature-based solutions across the city of Charleston, we do have to think of like size, scale, and what flood risk are we trying to manage, and just, again, using the water plan, how they talk about the different landforms throughout the city. Where do we really have the space for what size and scale? And I think sometimes people think on the peninsula, well, it's mostly a built environment where there's opportunities. Well, we're going after some NOAA funding, still exists, to restore the Newmarket Creek area as we tie that into our exciting new low-line project that the city's just put funding towards. And I'm going to call out my colleague just here, Mika Gadsden, our Director of Sustainability. She'll be doing a presentation to our Public Works Committee on this idea. It was really grassroots, community-driven of this ecological corridor and it builds on the principles of the water plan for the peninsula, where how do we reconnect historic creeks from the west side to the east side of the peninsula, and what sort of interventions at a natural scale can we bring back to our built environment? And that will be the Just Corridor, and Mika will be talking more about that soon. So that's a really exciting opportunity. And also under this recommendation from the water plan that we leverage partnerships, and one of those is our Army Corps partnership. And you've talked a lot about the Army Corps and involvement in the peninsula. Well, we also have a partnership with them where they are today, and they've kicked it off over a year now, of studying and helping come up with these same solutions and utilizing the water plan as their scoping measures in West Ashley and James Island and across the city. And that's where we have a lot of space to do some of these more exciting, larger scale, nature-based solutions that are provided in the water plan out, and where we can really help, help with some of our marsh restoration out there, that we have really healthy marsh out in West Ashley and James Island. And I think that's really exciting, not just because it comes with potentially 65% federal cost share for really expensive projects, but we're working through that today. And I think, and we're just wrapping up the city. We did out in the Church Creek Basin. We several years ago did a large-scale buyout of repetitive loss homes, where homeowners came to the city. They didn't want to be there anymore. And again, this is also a component, I'll be flipping back and forth, of the water plan, is this education and empowering residents. Maybe they don't know what options are out there, as we talked about, adaptive management for their communities. But this is a community that came to the city. They were ready to be out of their home, and the city identified it as an area we could do large-scale buyouts. And now it's basically going to be unveiled. It's almost complete. The Bridgepoint townhomes are where it exists. It's a stormwater park. It's a playground on dry days, but it helps store water on really wet days in an area where 30 plus homes were repetitively under flooding. So we're really doing different scale and size of actively nature-based solutions here in the city of Charleston. And, we continuously look to our cohort of neighbors, whether it's Atlanta or other coastal communities, to see how they're doing. But I have to be frank, when I talk to Miami, when I talk to Norfolk, when I talk to even New Orleans, I mean, they're looking at what we're doing, because we're actually really, we've been planning this, we've been coming up with solutions for a decade now, and they're really looking to see how, whether it's through working with the Army Corps and pushing them to be innovative on these solutions and getting them to think outside the box, they're looking to us. And I think that's a really exciting opportunity for Charleston.
I'll just add one quick note that as we work through the water plan and we modeled the 14 inches of sea level rise, you start to see where the marsh wants to migrate. And while that may not be a quote-unquote nature-based solution, allowing space and preserving space so that marsh can migrate, it's critically important to maintaining and preserving the identity of low country, but the marsh serves so many other benefits. I think it's really important as we start looking forward is how can we preserve those? How can we work with open land trust and things like that? I helped the Nature Conservancy several years ago with their North Coast Resilient Project, which is Horry and Georgetown County, just north of us. And it was really interesting. We did the two counties separate, and facilitating this nature-based green infrastructure conversation in Horry County, because of the way they've developed, because of their land use, it was very heavily skewed towards conservation and land management. Where in Georgetown, where it's more rural, and like the flooding problems downtown Georgetown are a little more acute, there's actually more like quote unquote green infrastructure and stormwater parks and things that you could have done. And it was just a really interesting balance as you looked at it. And I think that's also a good example as you look across the diverse landscape of the city.
So I'd like to zero in there on something you just mentioned. Can you talk to me about the importance of interjurisdictional planning when we're talking about climate adaptation? The water plan is Charleston's plan, but water does not necessarily respect nor adhere to political boundaries. We can start with either Jared or Kaylin, whoever wants to field the question first.
My colleague and friend Phil Sexton's here if he wants to speak about it. He's worked with the delegation that's really helped look across all the jurisdictions and just kind of get down to the root of what's the problem. Why isn't this ditch clean? Why is this pipe clogged? And who can deal with it? And I think if you look at James Island in particular, you've got the quilt of the city of Charleston, the town of James Island, SCDOT, unincorporated Charleston County. And you don't know where they stop and where they start, and it's really hard. And so, looking at a watershed scale approach, the only boundary water knows is the watershed boundary. And so looking upstream, looking downstream, and it's really it's that functional resilience, that day-to-day operations that are most important now by making sure that we maintain our infrastructure, by working together. And I think that was one of the key recommendations from a policy standpoint in the water plan is we have to work across these jurisdictions. We have to bring people together. There's been efforts to try, but we really need to try harder and succeed and work to succeed and just really coordinate across municipal boundaries and jurisdictional boundaries.
Sure, I can add. Yeah, I mean, echo everything that Jared said. I mean, it's obviously, again, water knows no boundaries. That's the basis what we're operating off of. It doesn't know political boundaries. It doesn't know neighborhood boundaries, road boundaries. So again, I'll sound like I'm just repeating myself, but I think it is really important to emphasize that when we start to think, we need to think in a more regional, and again, coming back to that funding question you asked, Jonah, how do we regionally look at what are the priorities from a community infrastructure standpoint for North Charleston, for Mount Pleasant, for the town of James Island, and how do we build collaboratively together, looking at like what could a local funding source for these kind of future projects be, I think is really important. And I think once we start communicating it, and we do at the city, we have really good relationships with our counterparts, and there's resilience officers in Mount Pleasant and at the county, and we work with even up to a tri-county level, and we were helping push through like a more resilience efforts and planning at that as well. So we do have these good relationships, but to Jared's point, just from like a maintenance issue, there's thousands of miles of ditches and drainage to clean. And again, getting to this education component for residents, they can call the city, but it could be SCDOT operates most of with our roads, which means they also are responsible for most of our ditches as well. And we certainly don't blame game and say somebody calls, well, just call them, right? We work, we have folks that we talk to and help coordinate and solve those problems. But it is just something that we do, the city can help lead and advocate for this more regional collaboration, and we are. But it is really critical that, other folks in our region and area and at the state level, and really exciting that we have a state office of resilience now. They released a resilience plan. They are also doing planning by watershed and basin. They're hiring up coordinators that are going to be around at different communities, and particularly we're lucky and resourceful at the city of Charleston in terms of some staff and capacity, but some of these smaller communities that Faith has talked about, they really need to rely on more regional entities to do this work to help us reach our goals too as a city, because we can't be siloed and just focusing on city boundaries of how we approach water, and we need to support like the buildup of capacity for our regional partners to do this as well.
I think I'll just add that obviously this is an economic issue for our city, our county, our region, our state. And we all have to do a better job of making sure that folks know how important the issue is, how existential the crisis is, and how, if we all work together, we can come up with solutions. But even within our own city, it's also important to have something for everyone, right? To have a defense in one section of the city, but adapt in another section. It's a question of what's in it for everybody so that they'll support the plan? How do you achieve buy-in? It is showing folks this is going to help your situation. And we know that it is a hard conversation. Yes, the community came and said, we'd like a buyout. But imagine the stress and trauma that community was in, dealing with constant repetitive flooding. Right? We can do better than that.
So I agree with all that. I'm going to take us up to 30 or 40,000 feet and look at Charleston. And to our east, we have the Atlantic Ocean, which is actually a wilderness area. We have the Francis Marion Forest just to the north of us. We have the Ace Basin to the south. And when we think about Charleston sitting right where it is, I like to think, yes, watersheds are key. I grew up in Maryland, spent most of my career in watershed planning with the state of Maryland and Virginia and Pennsylvania for the Chesapeake Bay. But even on a larger scale, connections are critically important. These regional connections, imagine if we connected Francis Marion Forest over to the Ace Basin, and then imagine with the eco corridor that's being proposed in Charleston and other greenways that are being proposed, that they radiate out and connect to those larger green patches. That's resiliency. That's really stitching together the landscape back in a way that provides that type of resiliency for flooding, for biodiversity, for heat island effect, for quality of life. And so, yes, we need to do watershed planning, we need to do community planning, but we also need to be thinking about those larger connections as well.
So I'd like to build on that a little bit more. With that question, we kind of looked outside of our political boundaries, but now I'd like to look closer inside. We've talked about it a few times throughout this conversation, but what's a responsible way to approaching engagement with the water plan? I know the city is also planning a series of open houses here over the next couple of months to kind of help residents get familiar with the plan a little bit more in depth. But how should and how will the city approach reaching out to those historically flooded communities? This is for the entire stage, so whoever wants to take it first, go for it.
Sure, I'm happy to start. I'll utilize what initiative that we've just kicked off now after Susan mentioned it in her opening remarks. And it's something we hope to pilot, but really the basis of when we're talking about these issues, and particularly certain communities that we want to, that rightfully so, have a historic distrust of dealing with the city, I step back as a city person and say, am I the correct messenger to be going and talking about necessarily everything that they need to hear from? Because somebody says, oh, city's coming, even if it's going to where somebody's at and meeting up at their time of day, they may just have no interest to hear from the city because repetitively over decades past, they haven't had what they wanted solved, right? So to me, it's finding these credible messengers and trusted community partners. And they help carry, I'm looking at Faith because she's one of them, right? Like helping carry this message that we want to convey. And again, when we're talking about education and really empowering residents, no matter what community they are in, to be their own stewards and advocates for their own plans, right? And their own solutions. The water plan is a roadmap. It lays out projects, but a foundation of that is the community deciding what path they want to take. And so right now we just kicked off with the community of Rosemont a resilience plan, and we found a trusted community partner of Low Country Alliance for Model Communities. They do amazing work in environmental justice communities and then in Charleston and North Charleston in our area. So I would encourage everyone to learn more about the amazing work that they're doing. But, when we went to Rosemont, we said, it's not a city plan for Rosemont. It is the community's plan for themselves. We will contribute funding to your flooding resilience plan, but it is your plan. So a part of that is also, again, going back to this idea of people have other things on their mind. Like I know they do, besides like thinking about flooding in 10, 25 years. So it's like, how do we build up the capacity to like even build in time to their lives? How do we value the time and not make it one-way transactional when they're coming to a public meeting? How do we follow up and provide the timelines and expectations? And we're doing that through this planning effort, and we're doing it because we are partnering with trusted folks that have already built really successful grounded trust in the community. And we're building this plan. And again, when we talk resilience planning, yeah, okay, it's going to look 20 years, but they have immediate, Faith mentioned it, they have immediate infrastructure needs that they need to see solved now to build buy-in, because they also don't trust that a community, they're going to be the people in this community benefiting from it in 25 years. So again, we talk resilience, it's a lot more issues sometimes than just flooding. It's like, it's a quality of life, right? And how are we building these other community benefits into resilience? And, it's really listening to the community and seeing the path that they want to take for that. So we're building this kind of roadmap of immediate steps, mid steps, and this longer term, looking at how they embrace their community through nature-based solutions. And it's really something we hope to be able to pilot in other communities in our city that have this growing need. And I will say one of the other really amazing aspects of the water plan is this social value and this intersection of mapping they did with social vulnerability and flood risk. And that's really helping guide the city as we're now evaluating, utilizing the water plan of where we're looking to invest in projects.
Okay, I'm glad nobody else has anything to say because I accidentally overstepped our time a little bit with that last question. So we're going to move on to the community Q&A portion. I'm going to hand it off to Toby to introduce that.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you all for the wonderful discussion. Now it's y'all's turn. So the Q&A portion, a few ground rules. Questions only, no comments, and try to keep the questions as concise as possible so we can get through as many as possible. I believe, is there going to be a microphone? This one? Any questions?
You mentioned water has no barriers. What are some of the organisms or organizations and structures to bring the multidisciplinary approach from various parts of town, the Tri-County area, the community, utilizing the waterworks as well, and the discussion because they're so critical to it. But what are the mechanisms and what are the committees or the groups that are set up that are attacking the water plan on a area-wide basis, and how can people get involved?
Well, I'll say that the Conservation League, we cover the coastal plain, and so we are actively involved all across within Charleston County on these issues. We were pleased to partner with Mount Pleasant Waterworks on an application for hard infrastructure for the 10-mile community. We are working hard to make sure that folks understand the implications of the necessity of that kind of infrastructure, but also sharing our knowledge and our hopes for nature-based solutions, for green infrastructure, building rain gardens. And so we actually have folks on our team who are working with communities to get those projects started and off the ground. So, I think our goal is to be a resource to help people understand what things are available to them now, but also to help them get activated and express what the community wants when it comes to consideration of plans that don't necessarily follow the guidance of the water plan.
I will address it from a governmental perspective and some committees and task force at the city. We've derived originally, it was our peninsula focused on the Army Corps project, Citizens Advisory Committee. That's now dovetailed into, we call it our Basin Flood Action Committee. And really it's made up of our mini ambassadors from all parts of the city that really are on, ears to the ground in their community, because we do think we have a very good grasp of what the challenges are, and the water plan helped highlight that. But to the point of some communities that maybe haven't been engaged, what are we missing, right? Like what is something that maybe there's a gap and that we need to bring and elevate more attention. So through that process of the Basin Flood Action Committee, we certainly want more of a public engagement. The city has also for several years now had a standing Resilience and Sustainability Advisory Committee where there's a wide array of stakeholders. I know the county has one as well. We're looking and talking to like the Berkeley, Charleston, Dorchester, our regional government entity about how, they're kind of the regional entity for transportation and they have a stormwater committee. How can we get them to start thinking more broadly and about bringing in this like resilience idea of planning and those efforts as well? That would be my biggest dream if as a region and a county, like when we're scoring transportation projects, like when we talk about safety, it's not just crashes, and that's important. How do we bring in like flood safety to that too? So we get weighted metrics for these projects to make them multi-beneficial. So that's really how we're starting. There's a state legislature, like sort of stormwater task force where we have our state legislatures check in, and we have Charleston Water Systems at the table and our public works entity. So again, it's like how do we don't always need to reinvent the wheel and bring in something new because sometimes there can be too many committees just to meet. So it's like how do we maybe utilize existing infrastructure that are already in place there and help elevate some of these topics we're talking about.
Okay. Hi, Adam Friend. I live on James Island, and there's a parcel of land behind our Woodland Shores that's currently now up to be considered to put, I think, 95 townhomes. I looked at the water plan when it was rolled out. I talked at the city meeting. I've met with Cogswell twice. This is something that they're actively trying to develop. And on that map, as you look at our basin, it's clearly designated. That's an old creek bed of James Island. So it's already a known flood-prone area. I can show you pictures now that equate to those, if not even more, in my own backyard and on properties all along our. Mr. Cogswell, I originally met with him, talked about, the hard thing is we're going to have to look to downzone. We're going to have to look to do these kind of things. And I understand that's a tough concept because you got people with money who own the land who want to build. And, I understand in America that's part of how we exist. But here we are. We have our roadmap. We already see this area in 50 years is designated to buy out a lot of our properties and turn it into a giant lake. That's the concept you all have already put out. How are we going to let these people go ahead and move forward and build and take away porous surface in an area that's clearly, to me, this is a poster child opportunity for us to say, hey, we're going to do something. But that's my question.
Well, I hear you. That is our challenge. I think Dale referred to these as legacy PUDs, right? The property rights were granted more than a decade ago. And then the world shifted. We had changing conditions. And so some of these rights were granted before we were experiencing or acknowledging that this is a creek bed. This is a series of wetland areas that will not work later. The challenge becomes who pays? Right? And if there is a loss of property rights, perhaps there's an opportunity to buy those developers out. But we ought to consider what's the actual value. Maybe that's not as high a number. Right? But also, when you look at rights coming forward, is it the government taking their property or is it the water? So I think there are opportunities to say, we aren't going to build here. And if you insist on building there, should the taxpayer cover the cost of their new wall? And so we have to put all those issues on the table as these proposals are coming forward. Declaring them legacy PUDs, I don't think is an answer for the people who are now going to come down from Jersey and buy them without any information about what is the potential to flood there.
I will just add too, I too hear you. The city, what we're doing right now, and the mayor mentioned it in his State of the City address last week, is we're really undergoing this kind of, hasn't been done before, this massive mapping and modeling initiative of every entitled development in the city, layering it on traffic counts, layering it on water plan maps to see and make like informed decisions of how we are going to smartly grow and where we are going to invest and where we are going to tackle and maybe look at where we could go after some greenbelt funding to maybe we did this successfully in recently in West Ashley with the Harmony property, where again it was something where it was projected to be thousands of homes. It was condensed, and then the lower end we were able actually to successfully get greenbelt funding for that, and now it's going to be a passive park space. So it's like where we need to know where these opportunities exist, and we're doing that. That's underway right now. Again, to identify this, I keep referencing to it as this community infrastructure and where it makes sense. Again, it is not an answer, but it is really hard when you've had these developments entitled before we were really tackling these issues 10 years ago, and now we're here to deal with the issues now, and that we have to find innovative ways to do that.
Can I add one more thing to that? In terms of our government bodies, one thing that came to the forefront during the Union Pier debate discussion was the fact that we were being asked to grant a PUD, but we didn't have the stormwater plan. We don't get to stormwater plans until the PUD has already been granted. So we're asked to grant property rights before we are clear on how they're going to handle the water. And perhaps as we look at our processes of government, stormwater might be one of those things you plan when you ask for those property rights on the front side. So just a suggestion.
I empathize with you as well. I think that we're in this, to sort of build on what Kaylin was saying, we're in this awkward teenage years right now with this water plan, and we're transitioning to actually implementing it, right? And so we're going to have these kinds of situations occur right now where we're maybe a little bit unprepared. But we've got to really hustle and get on our game. I think it also goes back to what I mentioned earlier about we need all of you to go out and really advocate for the zoning rewrite, for building standards and building codes. Those things get changed because we have citizens and communities that stand up and say, we want that changed. If they don't hear from you, if they don't hear from us, they're not going to get changed in the way we want them to change. And so we all need to help make that happen in order to get through this awkward stage and really be in a really good position to implement these types of things in the water plan. And I'll just say the water plan came up with these projects and these pretty renderings, but I think we all agree that was just a sort of visionary take on things. It's really the communities need to take that and own that and build that out over the years, not the water plan itself. The concepts are there, but the communities really need to lead that effort and what that's going to look like in the future.
We have time for one more question, if anyone else has one.
Sure, thanks. Hi, and thanks. I'm Rob Wendt, and Priscilla and I live in Harleston Village on Halsey Street, and we're interested in the status of the perimeter barrier, wall, raised edge, whatever. And this is a two-part question. Sorry to do this to you. What about with everything that the new policy objectives coming out of the new administration? What about our U.S. senators and members of Congress? Are they going to go to bat for us on funding? Where does all that stand?
Sure, I'll tackle that issue. Happy to. I actually am, because there's exciting updates. So we as we talked through, we've had this partnership with the Army Corps, started with the Peninsula, looking at storm surge. Obviously, storm surge is very serious. We did a vulnerability analysis in the city. It's our top economic life safety risk. But again, to this point of what are people paying attention to? And I like to say we have a kind of a collaborative team at the city working on these issues. We say, how do we make people care about a flood project on a sunny day? Because that's mostly what people are dealing with. But now they're dealing with tidal flooding on a sunny day. So, okay, we are not a $1 billion investment. How do we make it multi-beneficial, address multiple hazards that we're dealing with? So one way we went about that is we got a separate authorization for this tidal and inland study so we can actually integrate tidal benefits, stormwater benefits to this really transformational project that's going to be in our downtown peninsula. And we really, when we started thinking about it, they're like, they're talking about perimeter protection, a structure, a great, what do we already have that does that in Charleston and that people really enjoy and love? The Battery. So, okay, why don't we just extend that? And hey, we can utilize this process with the Corps to do that. So now we're really, we've had a report, we've got the authorization, some funding from our colleagues in Congress, and to answer, our senators are very supportive of the efforts that we're doing here in Charleston, as well as our congressional delegation, and we consider them champions no matter what's happening at a federal funding level. And actually meeting with them Thursday, they're coming down, some of their key staff is coming down to the Battery with the Army Corps, and we also so we were very valuable and really, really appreciate that relationship. But as we're moving forward and progressing with the Peninsula project, it was quite clear that the line on a map that was provided in the chief's report, some of the ideas out there of what this could look like, we really as a city needed to build confidence that it would be designed and made in a way that is, again, a public amenity. It's going to make sense from like a pedestrian access. On the west side, it's going to integrate with the Ashley River crossing. We're going to have more bicycle traffic. How do we connect our whole peninsula while also protecting it? So Jared and Keith, our water plan team, they've been working for the past almost 6 months on a refinement of this alignment and design goals and how we get it to the Battery extension. And I will plug our WaterWise open houses that we'll be having in May. We'll be having some more information to share with folks specifically on the peninsula right here in this room, coincidentally. So stay tuned. It's progressing. There's a lot of things just happening of processes, and again, we're integrating this tidal and inland study that we have for the other parts of the city into this project to really make it a multi-beneficial project and address many things. So lots of movement happening, and I will say too, I'll just plug for myself while I have the mic. My role too, as we're talking about community engagement, is please, if your neighborhood's having a meeting or something like that and you want to hear more details specific from the city about these projects, I am here. That is my job, is to come out and help talk about these things as well and provide updates. So I'm happy to do that too.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. If there's a question that we didn't get to, please feel free to email me or Jonah, and we'll find an answer if we can. This is our first Rising Waters Lab event this year. There will be others throughout the state. We'll keep you updated via our newsletter, which magically appears in inboxes on Tuesday, if you want to subscribe to that. And then we just want to say thank you again to our panelists and our co-sponsors, Groundswell and the Sierra Club. Yes, they did great. And we also just want to thank all of you. Without you, the Rising Waters Lab wouldn't exist. So thank you. And I would like to now pass the mic off to Christine von Klonitz, and she's going to give us some concluding remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. When I attend events like this, I tend to write little notes about what people are saying, and here are some of the notes I took tonight. Design for what rainfall could look like. Grant property rights before the stormwater plans are due. And imagine connecting the Francis Marion to the Ace Basin. Wow. That was a big one, with big star on my list there. All right, so thank you for joining us this evening for this incredible forum. On behalf of the Sierra Club, our team, and all the supporting organizations, I want to express our deepest gratitude to our moderators and panelists for sharing their expertise, perspectives, and time. The challenge that you met tonight was to interpret a detailed and comprehensive plan and spark meaningful dialogue that contributes to our understanding of that plan. I'd also like to thank Mayor Cogswell, City Council, and staff for their continued focus on the work necessary to implement this plan. We all know that what nature is capable of throwing at us. Dale knew. He was insistent on his belief in us and our ability to defend against these threats to what all of us love. The city can do this. The city has been and is continuing to demonstrate its mettle through projects like US 17 Spring Fishburne Drainage Improvement Project. Once completed, this project will increase the flow rate of the water by 10 times its previous capacity. This project also contributes to the safety of the medical district by tying in new drainage tunnels there. The Forest Acres drainage improvement serves several West Ashley neighborhoods, including Washington Park and North Forest Acres. There's also Market Street, Windermere, and the upcoming Barberry Woods drainage projects. There are too many projects to list here. That's a great thing. We need to celebrate all of those, but we need to know we're here tonight because we know that there's more, much more that needs to be done. The Sierra Club's mission is to explore, enjoy, and protect the wild places of the earth. We have the National Park System today due to the efforts of our founder, John Muir. It took thinking on a grand scale to make that happen. The water plan is another grand scale strategy for all the city's drainage basins. It's looking at water for what it is, a resource to protect and to protect from. Explore the planning areas of the water plan that highlight the immediate and aspirational strategies of your drainage basin. Help protect our community and quality of life by attending the city's WaterWise Charleston open houses this May. Focus on this picture of flooding so that we can focus more on this picture of enjoying our waterways. I'd like to thank the audience for your thoughtful questions and engagement. If you've lived in Charleston for any length of time, you understand that water defines our experience. How and where will we give water its place? We need to make a place for water. We need to act now, and we need to adapt over time. We hope you're leaving tonight with new ideas, inspiration, and awareness of what is needed from you and all our communities. Thank you for attending.
Thank you. And as final remarks, we just want to thank you from the Post and Courier. At the Post and Courier, we believe in strong journalism, and this builds strong communities. Our Rising Waters team, launched in 2023, is fully funded by community support through our Public Service and Investigative Fund. What began with one resident's passion to address flooding has grown into a dedicated team producing over 200 climate stories. If you'd like to contribute, there are pledge cards on your seats. And today, if you do contribute, you will receive a free Post and Courier rain gauge. So turn it into me and I will give you the rain gauge. Thank you again and have a great night.